Imagine a world where colossal stones lock together like puzzle pieces no tool today can easily replicate, where entire cities align with the stars as though guided by an unseen hand, and where ancient builders carved, lifted, and shaped impossible materials with precision that seems to outpace their era. How did they do it? What knowledge have we forgotten? And why do structures separated by oceans echo one another in patterns no known civilization ever recorded? The deeper we look, the stranger questions become, and the answers may lie far deeper than the ruins themselves. Beneath the thinning air of the high Andean sky, where distant ridges fade into a soft blue haze, the walls of Sacsayhuaman rise with gravity that feels older than memory. Their vast limestone blocks settle into the hillside above Cusco, like the segmented spine of some immense geological creature, drawing the ice slowly along their zigzagging profile. Each stone, many taller than a person and weighing many tons, sits in place without mortar, fitted so tightly to its neighbors that even a blade of grass struggles to penetrate the seams. As one walks the serpentine terraces, a deliberate rhythm unfolds, a geometry that bends and pivots as though echoing sacred forms embedded in the Andean worldview. Across the stone faces, faint tool marks mingle with the soft abrasion of centuries, suggesting hands that shape the blocks through techniques both practical and intuitive. Hammerstones, abrasion, and a patient dialogue with stubborn rock produce surfaces so exact that the stones seem molded rather than carved. Yet, contradictions accumulate. Inca masonry elsewhere, remarkable as it is, rarely exhibits the same colossal scale, or the wildly intricate polygonal interlocking seen here. Chronicles describe expansions atop earlier foundations, but they remain vague about the deepest layers of construction, leaving open the possibility that the most massive terraces emerged from a cultural phase less documented than the imperial period. Archaeologists studying quarries such as Rumacalca and Muina, along with pathways and ramps carved into slopes, have shown that human labor, organization, and persistence can account for the movement of enormous stones. But the precision with which the blocks lock together, sometimes with a dozen interlocking faces, still invites speculation about techniques of alignment, surveying, and incremental shaping that have not survived in written form. Cultural upheavals after Spanish arrival erased much of the intangible knowledge that might have explained the methods behind such work. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that teams armed with wooden levers, rope, and determination can indeed maneuver stones of formidable size. Still, the silence and presence surrounding Sacsayhuaman's terraces inspire thoughts of deeper cultural layers, including the Quilca people, whose ceramics predate the Inca by several centuries. Their architectural remains appear modest compared to the megalithic scale of these walls, raising the possibility that construction unfolded in multiple episodes across shifting political landscapes. And as sunset slides across the plateau, the walls reveal subtle curvatures, gentle convex surfaces, inclined joints, and small angle adjustments that imply a sensitivity to seismic stresses and hillside tension, a structural intelligence encoded directly into stone. Workshops scattered along the slopes, unfinished blocks, and cut channels support a narrative of trial, refinement, and human adaptability. But the immense investment of labor remains tied to cultural motivations we can only glimpse: cosmological order, territorial power, ceremonial meaning. When one imagines the original skyline, towers and platforms unbroken by later destruction, the site becomes not a puzzle of engineering, but a landscape shaped by a worldview we no longer possess. What seems mysterious today may simply be the absence of the stories that once animated the labor. As the winds shift across the terraces and silence gathers in the cracks between stones, the walls offer not explanations, but an open field of wonder. Even when the engineering is understood, the deeper reasons for creation remain just beyond reach, carried on the cool Andean air and dissolving into the distances beyond Cusco. Across the wide, wind-scoured Altiplano of Bolivia, where the horizon stretches in a pale arc and mountains waver like distant mirages, the H-blocks of Puma Punku rest in a stillness that feels ceremonial. Their andesite forms lie scattered as though fragments of a geometric lexicon whose syntax has faded over time. Right angles, recessed grooves, notched corners, and precisely carved channels invite close inspection. The crisp edges give the impression of a system of measurement capable of tolerances rarely associated with pre-industrial tools. The stone itself, hard, fine-grained andesite, poses its own challenge. Yet the Tiwanaku civilization, to which the site is attributed, possess established techniques of stone hammering, sand abrasion, and copper alloy chiseling that, while slow, can produce the clean planes visible here. The scattered arrangement of the blocks, toppled and repurposed over centuries, complicates the reconstruction of any original architectural scheme. Some blocks may belong to a single platform. Others could represent multiple stages of construction layered atop earlier foundations, now obscured. Mapping the cut marks, joint styles, and unfinished pieces reveals a landscape of workshops and planned labor rather than lost machinery. The real puzzle may lie in the organization required to quarry, transport, and lift such dense stones in a region where cold winds, altitude, and scarce timber restricted available techniques. The builders likely relied on sophisticated coordination, timed labor cycles, seasonal work windows, and communal effort, leaving minimal residue in the archaeological record but surviving in the consistency of the finished surfaces. Contradictions persist, especially in the uniformity of certain cuts that suggest modularity. At first glance, some blocks appear mass-produced, but closer examination shows subtle irregularities, asymmetries, and weathered edges that root them firmly in the realm of hand craftsmanship. The appearance of precision itself contributes to speculation. Perhaps Tiwanaku artisans used templates, jigs, or standardized guidelines that facilitated repetition but have not survived. The broader Tiwanaku complex shows careful astronomical alignments and ritual observances woven into architecture, raising the hypothesis that the H-blocks once formed part of a larger symbolic or functional structure whose meaning is now fragmented across time. Centuries of erosion, collapsed fill, and shifting soil layers have further displaced the stones, creating patterns that might not reflect their original arrangement. Multiple construction episodes may be intertwined here, some coherent, others experimental, each leaving imprints that later generations reinterpreted or abandoned. The mineral composition of the andesite, resistant yet workable through sustained abrasion, suggests a long dialogue between mason and stone. Each notch, recess, and angle speaks to a patient process that demanded knowledge, endurance, and cultural intention rather than unknown technologies. In the end, the mystery of Pumapunku may lie not in how the stones were carved, but in how the builders perceived their world, a worldview where geometry, ceremony, and landscape fuse into a unified order. The blocks remain in quiet disarray, their meanings weathered but not extinguished, inviting us to consider not only the techniques that shaped them but the mindset that imagined such forms, and the chapters of human experience that disappeared long before the questions began. Though the clean lines of Pumapunku's andesite blocks often invite comparisons to industrial machining, beneath these technical questions lies a deeper curiosity about the worldview that justified raising such forms at high altitude. For the Tiwanaku sphere, where ritual agriculture, pilgrimage routes, and political integration spanned vast highland distances, monumental stones served not merely as architecture, but as a material anchor linking earthly presence to cosmic order. The H-blocks may once have belonged to a platform or gateway where celestial orientation and ceremonial movement converged, a structure whose collapse obscured both its original shape and the conceptual framework that gave it meaning. As evening light spreads across the plateau and the blocks glow along their sharpened edges while their recesses deepen into shadow, the sight feels less like a puzzle demanding a mechanical explanation and more like a place quietly resisting full translation. Even with detailed archaeological insight, aspect of ancient intention, ritual patterns, symbolic geometry, seasonal gatherings attuned to the highland sky, survive only in faint echoes within alignments and soil layers. The H-blocks remain both evidence and enigma, grounded in known techniques, yet hinting persistently at an architectural vision whose outline hovers just beyond reconstruction, dissolving softly into the cool breath of the Altiplano. Across the forested foothills of Japan, where cedar canopies breathe mist and volcanic ridges fold into shadow, clusters of polygonal masonry emerge along forgotten fortifications and enigmatic terraces. Weather-darkened stones meet in sweeping, irregular patterns, multi-angle blocks fitted without mortar, their edges settling into place as though persuaded rather than forced. At first glance, these walls suggest no lost machinery, only deliberate craftsmanship shaped by seismic realities and uneven terrain. Japan's deep acquaintance with earthquakes offers a practical rationale. Interlocking stones disperse lateral force, allowing walls to shift without collapsing. Yet as one's attention lingers, small contradictions begin to unsettle simple explanations. Some walls exhibit a level of precision, scale, or complexity seemingly inconsistent with the organizational structures traditionally attributed to periods in question. A few blocks are faceted so intricately that they meet their neighbors along tight, multi-surface seams, forming geometries rarely documented in surviving early Japanese texts. That ambiguity has prompted speculation, local innovation, continental influence, or a lineage of stoneworking that evolved across isolated centers of authority, carried through trained hands but never fully recorded. As archaeologists trace quarry marks, joint patterns, and stone distribution, a fragmented picture emerges of workshops near volcanic outcrops where andesite or tuff could be shaped with iron tools in later eras, or with stone and bronze implements earlier on. But many polygonal segments have been disturbed by later castle reconstructions, which often reused ancient foundations and blended original stones with later additions. The resulting composite walls must be disentangled layer by layer. For centuries of lichen growth, landslides, and sediment accumulation blur the transitions between early experimentation and subsequent refinement. Amid such complexities, the stones retain an aura of quiet intentionality. In certain cases, polygonal arrangements approach a sculptural intuition, stones tapering inward or curving subtly to match slope gradients, suggesting builders who possess not only functional skill, but a practiced sense of how to coax stability from terrain shaped by tectonic unpredictability. This sensitivity implies a long-standing tradition of stone handling whose origins may lie beyond the reach of surviving structures. The scarcity of large-scale megalithic construction in Japan's earliest periods deepens attention. Modest political units and limited written records contrast with the ambition evident in the most elaborate polygonal segments. It is possible that small groups of highly trained artisans, perhaps tied to regional ritual centers or elite domains, transmitted specialized methods that left no explicit textual legacy. Cultural contact through the Korean peninsula or maritime networks may have introduced certain stoneworking concepts, but the distinctive Japanese adaptations, blocks subtly leaning inward, stone shaped to follow natural contours, anchor the craft within its own landscape logic. Many of the structures were likely not fortresses in the strict sense, but terraces, platforms, or ceremonial boundaries whose functions combined defense, processional movement, and symbolic authority. Later castle builders reshaped these earlier forms into more linear gun battery bastions, obscuring the original geometry. Yet even beneath medieval layers, the old stones preserve the softness of earlier contours, the slight asymmetry of steps worn into slopes, hinting at intentions rooted in stabilizing the land and marking sacred or administrative spaces long before written chronicles. As twilight touches these remnants, the stones shift from geometric puzzle to atmospheric presence. Their shadows fall across moss and fallen leaves in patterns that echo the quiet logic hidden in their joints, blurring the line between engineering and expression. The result is a craft at once knowable and elusive, grounded in seismic adaptation, yet tinged with the possibility that its most intricate examples reflect a chapter of architectural thought whose narrative never survived. The stones speak in the soft language of joined angles and weathered surfaces, offering no definitive explanation, but inviting the patient observer deeper into the wooded hills where history and landscape merge. Under the pale radiance that settles over the Argive plain at dawn, when the Peloponnese rises in muted tears, and the air carries a clean mineral scent of limestone, the Lion Gate of Mycenae stands like a threshold between worlds. Its massive lintel and flanking monoliths compress the passage into a narrow corridor, channeling movement beneath the carved relief of two lions poised around a central column. Crafted from finer limestone than the surrounding conglomerate walls, the relief announces a symbolic intent distinct from the stark structural mass beneath it, an emblem of authority, divinity, or lineage whose exact meaning has softened across 3,000 years. The cyclopean walls that frame the gate, built from stones weighing many tons, introduce a tension between their immense scale and the Bronze Age technologies used to raise them. Archaeological evidence confirms the use of sledges, levers, ropes, and coordinated labor, yet the seeming ease with which the blocks were set remains visually striking. The engineered ascent leading toward the gate was shaped to expose incoming visitors to the sightlines of defenders above, turning approach into ritualized submission. The gate thus becomes not merely an entrance, but an experience, one shaped by the waning palatial authority and complex network of alliances within which Mycenae once operated. Contradictions linger in the masonry itself. The blocks appear irregular on their outer faces, yet aligned with deliberate efficiency within the walls. They lack the fitted precision of other ancient traditions, but still radiate an unmistakable intentionality. Their battered faces project strength, while the hidden joints point to a practical system emphasizing mass over refinement. Geological studies indicate that local limestone naturally fractured into large, useful shapes, making monumental construction a logical extension of available resources. Such choices reinforce both defensive strength and symbolic dominance, the walls serving as physical and ideological fortification. Examining the relief slab reveals its own subtleties. Uneven lion paws, faint tool marks, a surface once brightened with pigment, now reduced to weathered texture. These details reflect artisans working with bronze chisels, abrasion, and steady hands rather than unknown mechanisms. The composition's origins, with its heraldic symmetry and central column reminiscent of Minoan iconography, point toward cultural dialogues across the Aegean inferred through shared motifs rather than preserved texts. Mycenae's written record survives mostly in administrative tablets, lists of goods, offerings, and duties, not in narratives explaining why the lines were carved or what meanings the builders hoped the gate would convey. As the early light gathers in the triangular relieving space above the lintel, the gate reveals itself as both monumental architecture and fragmentary memory, a convergence of engineering, symbolism, and Bronze Age worldview that endures even as much of its conceptual world has faded. The Lion Gate stands, like many ancient works, at the point where evidence ends and interpretation begins, offering a carefully shaped passage into a civilization whose stones speak more clearly than its surviving words. And as archaeologists reconstruct the successive phases of Mycenaean fortification, initial walls, later expansions, modifications to the gate's approach, they recover a palimpsest of political rise and reorganization. The citadel's growth mirrors periods of increased regional authority and administrative complexity, yet the Lion Gate's monumentalism stands slightly apart from this rhythm. It seems less a utilitarian entrance than a statement of identity, its relief perhaps invoking protective deities or ancestral legitimacy embedded in an oral tradition now lost. The engineering behind it is entirely comprehensible. The relieving triangle channels weight away from a lintel too massive to support itself. The inward-leaning walls create compressive stability. The massive stones anchor each other through sheer mass. But the experience of standing beneath the gate invites a layer of reflection that exceeds the structural logic. The palatial system collapsed only generations after the gate's construction, leaving the once grand threshold to weather abandonment, destruction, and reuse. Later Greeks, gazing upon the Cyclopean walls, attributed them to mythical giants, an act of cultural memory that preserved all while erasing historical specificity. Yet the gate's survival through earthquakes and invasion signals not technological mystery, but refined intuition about weight, mass, and endurance. The decision to place symbolic sculpture above a military choke point reveals a worldview in which authority and art were inseparable, each reinforcing the other through spatial choreography. As sunlight moves across the citadel, casting shadows beneath the lions' bodies and lighting the worn stones beneath, the gate softens into something more intricate, an artifact of a culture whose complexities remain partly hidden in untranslated ideologies and incomplete archives. Its blend of rugged engineering and subtle iconography opens interpretive space for questions about ritual movement, psychological impact, and the messaging encoded in monumental thresholds. As dust settles into the crevices and edges of the conglomerate blocks, the gate regains its stillness, holding its secrets without withholding its presence. It stands as a threshold into an ancient imagination that scholarship can chart but never fully enter, leaving its deepest meanings hovering like an echo over quiet valleys where history and myth drift together in unresolved harmony. Across the rolling steppe of the southern Urals, with a grassland stretch in muted gold beneath a restless sky, the circular outline of the arcane fortress emerges with restraint that hides the sophistication once embedded in its timber and clay geometry. Beneath the faint traces visible today lies a concentric design of dwellings, passageways, drainage systems, and defensive rings, an arrangement so rigorously planned that the entire settlement moved as a unified organism. Archaeology reveals a community tied to the Syntashta or early Andronovo horizon, known for advanced metallurgy, pastoral mobility, and ritual practices that left widely dispersed yet incomplete traces across the region. Archaeum was neither a simple fortress nor a conventional town. Its inward-facing dwellings, shared central courtyard, and carefully controlled entry points suggest a settlement shaped equally by practical security, social cohesion, and symbolic intent. Contradictions emerge as the evidence accumulates. The defensive ditches and watchful layout imply vigilance or conflict, while precise radial patterns and aligned doorways hint at ritual or cosmological considerations. Some researchers have suggested astronomical correspondences between structural axes and solstitial events. Ideas approached cautiously but not dismissed, given broader patterns of sky-oriented ritual among steppe societies. Excavations reveal slag, furnace remains, and bronze-working debris, painting a picture of a specialized metallurgical center. Yet the ordered distribution of workshops implies oversight, perhaps an administrative or ceremonial structure, though no writing survives to clarify how authority operated within this circular plan. Archaeum's life was brief. It appears to have been intentionally burned, leaving behind a frozen moment that preserves floor plans, storage pits, animal bones, and scattered tools. But the reasons for this destruction, conflict, ritual abandonment, environmental pressure, or internal reorganization, remain entangled in silence. The settlement's symmetrical design raises questions about whether its builders drew on inherited steppe traditions, or whether Archaeum represents a rare experiment, a crystallization of architectural ideas typically expressed in more dispersed pastoral settings. Traces of copper distribution, artifact parallels across distant sites, and the presence of high-status horse equipment suggests a role in broader networks linking the Urals to far-flung communities. Connections to chariot-associated burial mounds nearby reinforce the impression of society invested in symbolic displays of status and ritualized authority. What remains unclear is how such coordination was organized without the monumental hierarchies known from later states. No grand palaces, temples, or monumental stone constructions survive, only the clarity of a circular plan executed with precision. Standardized passage widths, consistent dwelling modules, and carefully graded drainage ditches imply collaborative labor shaped by shared frameworks rather than imposing central command. Yet the absence of written evidence leaves leadership structures conjectural. Archaeum's ambiguity deepens in the spaces where evidence thins. Few burials lie within the settlement, perhaps reflecting a deliberate separation between living and ancestral realms. The circular layout itself may encode social or cosmological divisions now impossible to reconstruct, and the intentional burning leaves the settlement as both a preserved blueprint and an interrupted story, inviting speculation even as it denies resolution. As the steppe wind sweeps across the faint depressions, blurring the lines drawn in excavation trenches, Archaeum becomes less an archaeological site than an atmospheric presence, its clarity overshadowed by the quietness of what it does not reveal. In the fading light, the rings of earth and the reconstructed traces settle into a poised ambiguity, reminding us that some ancient structures endure not through answer questions, but through their capacity to hold open a space where questions multiply. Across the chalk downlands of Salisbury Plain, where morning mist drifts low over grasses and the horizon softens into pale light, Stonehenge rises in its familiar circle of trilithons and bluestones. Its silhouette conceals a long, intricate sequence of construction phases, shifting intentions and ritual adaptations. Beneath its standing stones lie ditches, cremation burials, timber post circles, and alignments that map centuries of evolving relationships between community, landscape, and sky. Approaching along the ancient processional avenue, worn by generations of ceremonial passage, the monument first presents an openness rather than enclosure. The stones frame sky, horizon, and seasonal light, suggesting a function rooted not in walls or boundaries but in visibility, orientation, and movement. Even as their sheer size and paired arrangement invite reflection on the labor involved in hauling multi-ton sarsens from the Marlborough Downs and transporting smaller bluestones from distant Welsh outcrops, journeys fully achievable through human ingenuity, yet still remarkable in scale. The monument's broader setting reveals a landscape shaped by generations rather than a single act of creation. Around Stonehenge lie Aubrey holes tracing an early circular boundary, long barrows stretching across the chalk, Curses monuments cutting linear paths through the plain, and timber circles at nearby Dington walls echoing a seasonal symmetry. Together they form a ritual topography in which Stonehenge appears not as an isolated enigma, but as one node within a wider choreography linking the living, the ancestral, and the sky. The processional movements implied by post-hole alignments and artifact clusters remain only partly reconstructible, and the ambiguity surrounding these rituals threads through every interpretation of the site. Yet the solstitial alignment of the great trilithons offers a stable point within these uncertainties. Whether the orientation served calendrical, ceremonial, symbolic, or blended purposes remains open to careful debate, for archaeological evidence gestures toward feasting, seasonal gatherings, and long-distance social networks, without fully revealing the cosmological frameworks that shape them. Contradictions appear in the monument's layering. The circular ditch predates the iconic stone settings by centuries. The blue stones were moved and rearranged multiple times. Cremation burials once occupied the earliest phases before later uses shifted emphasis toward gathering and monumental display. These overlapping functions suggest a landscape where boundaries between remembrance, cosmology, and communal life were permeable, evolving across generations. Close study of the stones reveals methods more legible than motives. Hammerstone work shaped the sarsens into uprights and lintels fitted with mortise and tenon joints. The tongue and groove system stabilizes their weight without hidden technology. Yet the raising of the trilithons required coordination on a scale that implies strong communal bonds, shared belief, or social obligation rather than centralized command. The blue stone's multiple relocations, set, reset, grouped, dispersed, hint at shifting associations, perhaps tied to mythic homelands or ancestral connections rather than fixed architectural logic. Their geological origins near the Preseli Hills imply ties that extended far beyond the local chalk plain, connections more cultural than mechanical, encoded in memory rather than inscription. The engineering of Stonehenge becomes more expressive when placed within its surrounding features. The avenue aligned to solstitial light, the heel stone positioned as a sentinel marking celestial passage, the Bronze Age barrows that later clustered around the monument as its original meaning shifted or faded. Each layer adds to the cumulative record, complicating attempts to isolate Stonehenge as a single cultural statement. The partial ruin, fallen stones, missing lintels, eroded carvings, evokes not failure but transformation, a reminder that the site's significance changed as new generations interpreted or abandoned older rituals. As evening light stretches across the plain, softening edges and drawing long shadows between the uprights, Stonehenge becomes less a puzzle to solve than a lens through which the fluidity of ancient belief becomes faintly visible. It stands at the crossroads of engineering and intention, its purpose neither wholly revealed nor wholly obscure. What remains is a horizon of possibility defined by what can be measured, the alignments, the tool marks, the stratigraphy, and what cannot be fully recovered, the rhythms of processions, the stories carried into the circle, the meanings encoded in light and stone. Stonehenge endures as an echo of a world where identity, memory, and sky converged, leaving only traces of a worldview now glimpsed in the chalk beneath our feet and the slow arc of the sun that still passes through its frame. Across the Giza Plateau, beneath the pale dust-swept light where desert meets the slow shimmer of the Nile Valley, the arrangement of the Great Pyramids reveals itself with a quiet precision that goes unnoticed at first. Beyond their iconic forms lies a spatial logic binding Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure to a larger constellation of causeways, valley temples, quarries, boat pits, worker settlements, and mastaba fields. These elements together form a ritual and administrative grid that integrates engineering, cosmology, and royal ideology without collapsing neatly into a single interpretive scheme. As one walks the plateau, the careful proportions between monuments begin to suggest a landscape-scale blueprint rooted in the Old Kingdom's desire to align earthly order with celestial cycles. Khufu's cardinal orientation, achieved through observation of circumpolar stars, anchors the plateau both symbolically and practically, while the natural ridge provides stable ground for the successive complexes. Though the engineering relies on tools and techniques well within the reach of Old Kingdom organization, sledges, levers, ramps, copper chisels, and labor mobilized through taxation or obligation, the broader grid raises subtler questions. Causeways link valley temples to mortuary temples along axial lines that once guided ritual movement from the floodplain toward the desert edge. Mastabas arranged in ordered fields mirror the pyramid's monumentality at human scale, each tomb's placement reflecting proximity to royal authority. The entire plateau feels consciously orchestrated, as though the landscape served as an architectural extension of state ideology. Yet contradictions appear within the pyramid sequence itself. Differences in slope angle, internal passage design, casing methods, and platform height reflect shifting priorities and evolving engineering practices. Khafre's slightly steeper angle and elevated base create an illusion of dominance despite its smaller volume, while Menkaur's more modest pyramid introduces refinements in stone choice and craftsmanship. These variations complicate the idea of a unified master plan, suggesting instead a lineage adapting inherited principles to each reign's ideological and logistical constraints. Geological considerations shape decisions as well. Khufu's builders exploited the plateau's highest stable bedrock. Khafre's used a natural rise to amplify visual scale. Menkaur's team incorporated granite from Aswan to signal status even as overall size diminished. As researchers analyzed foundation trenches, quarry scars, and debris fields, patterns emerged that tie construction decisions to both symbolism and on-site adaptation. The Sphinx, carved directly from a limestone knoll, extends a grid eastward toward the rising sun, though its precise relationship to Khafre's complex remains clouded by incomplete inscriptions and later restorations. The worker village, its bakeries, barracks, administrative offices, and craft workshops, ground a monumental grid and live human labor, revealing a community structured around rotation, provisioning, and centralized oversight. But the plateau's coherence is never absolute. Bedrock dips unevenly, forcing builders to cut terraces and adjust plans. Ramps were built, extended, dismantled, leaving traces that suggest fluid problem-solving rather than a single architectural script. Over time, erosion, quarrying, and burial have obscured parts of the grid, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct intentions from partial evidence. The result is a landscape that feels ordered yet adaptive, monumental yet responsive to terrain and political need. As the sun lowers across Giza, casting long shadows that emphasize both the precision and the massive structures, the grid reveals itself not as a diagram of lost technology, but as the imprint of a worldview in which engineering, cosmology, and kingship converged. The pyramid stand is the most visible element of a system whose deeper logic lies in the interplay between natural contours, ritual pathways, and the labor of thousands whose names are mostly unpreserved. And in this interplay, the plateau holds its enduring magnetism, a reminder that even when construction techniques are understood, the cultural imagination that shaped the desert into a sacred landscape remains partly beyond reach, suspended in the quiet geometry of sand, stone, and sky. For the settlement's layout corresponds closely with supply routes and rotating work teams whose coordinated labor allowed the precise placement of blocks across ascending courses. Yet the ephemeral nature of the workers' village, its mud brick houses, wooden frames, and temporary installations, contrasts sharply with the stone permanence of the pyramids, creating a tension between the monumentality designed for eternity and the impermanence of the infrastructure that enabled its creation. This tension echoes the broader ambiguity between function and symbolism across the plateau, where practical engineering coexists with conceptual architecture shaped by royal ideology. Speculation sharpens when astronomical correlations enter the discussion, alignments of internal shafts with circumpolar stars or Orion's belt, orientations that reflect a worldview in which the king's afterlife journey intertwined with cosmic order. Yet these interpretations must navigate shifting sky positions, incomplete Old Kingdom texts, and the theological revisions of later dynasties. Celestial symbolism clearly permeated Egyptian thought, but the specific intentions encoded in the plateau's geometry may never be fully retrieved, obscured by the fragmentary nature of surviving evidence and the reinterpretations layered upon earlier beliefs. Still, the plateau invites such questioning. Walking between the pyramids, the spatial relationships feel rooted in logistics, yet quietly suggestive of a larger conceptual architecture. Shadow lines at dawn and dusk shift in subtle variations across the year, interacting with causeways and thresholds in ways that may once have guided ritual processions or marked seasonal rites. Abandoned blocks, unfinished casing stones, and half-shaped quarry fragments add a human layer of incompletion, reminding us that even the most iconic monuments were built through processes marked by adaptation, seasonal pressures, and practical constraints, not by the execution of a single perfect plan. When late afternoon wind blurs the horizon and softens the edges of the pyramids, The grid dissolves into something more atmospheric. Intention remains, but clarity thins. The arrangement becomes a landscape where engineering is explicable, yet symbolic depth recedes beyond analytical reach. Its full meaning once carried through ritual practice, oral tradition, and lived participation. Thus, the Giza grid endures as both precision and enigma, a landscape-scale synthesis of organization and cosmological imagination whose technical aspects are understood, yet whose deeper story survives only in faint outlines traced by the long shadows stretching across the plateau as the sun sinks toward the river and the desert falls into quiet repose. Across the broad basin of central Mexico, where high-altitude air sharpens the horizon and distant sierras rise like muted blue walls, the urban plan of ancient Teotihuacan unfurls in geometry both disciplined and enigmatic. Beneath the weathered facades of its pyramids and compounds lies a vast grid rotated slightly off true north, its principal avenue drawing a diagonal axis oriented toward the Pyramid of the Moon. Along this spine, plazas, waterways, temple compounds, and residential districts form an intricate pattern whose rationale blends practicality, cosmology, and civic identity. The Avenue of the Dead, with its monumental rhythm, suggests a city conceived not through incremental village accretion, but through early centralized planning that transformed the basin into a stage of architectural expression. Yet without deciphered text, the ideological conception behind this order remains accessible only through alignments, building phases, and the distribution of artifacts within the urban fabric. Contradictions appear when comparing the city's monumental scale with the tools available to its builders. Archaeology confirms the use of stone hammers, wooden scaffolds, and human labor, but the magnitude of the pyramids and the precision of the grid raise questions about coordination across a multi-ethnic populace. This complexity intensifies when considering the city's deliberate rotational offset, which aligns with the Cerro Gordo Massif and may reflect calendrical or symbolic considerations. Interpretations remain debated. Shifting horizons, structural expansions, and evolving ritual needs blur the distinction between astronomical and mythic landscapes. Excavations near the Pyramid of the Sun reveal superimposed constructions and a long sequence of architectural reconfigurations, suggesting that while the grid endured, ceremonial centers evolve in response to changing priorities. Subterranean tunnels, canals, and engineered drainage systems add another dimension, an invisible infrastructure paralleling the visible monumentality. This layering reinforces a sense of city designed in multiple registers at once: sacred, administrative, hydraulic, and residential. Teotihuacan's apartment compounds complicate the image of homogeneity. Their varying sizes, orientations, murals, and ritual installations point to neighborhoods with distinct identities, specialized craft enclaves devoted to obsidian, pottery, shell inlay, and other industries. Economic corridors intersect ceremonial ones, creating a city whose surface order masked a rich tapestry of occupations and affiliations. The water management network reveals further interconnection: canals threading between compounds, modified riverbeds, and plazas that may have turned reflective during rains, linking cosmology with environment. Such interpretations remain provisional, but hint at a worldview in which urban space mediated between natural cycles, mythic origins, and political authority. Teotihuacan's decline adds another layer of ambiguity. Burned elite compounds and the abandonment of ceremonial zones point to internal tension, ecological strain, or ideological fragmentation long before the city emptied. Yet the grid itself remained intact, a silent framework surviving its own collapse. Archaeologists reconstruct meaning from murals, offerings, and architectural footprints, but the city's governing mythology remains only partially accessible. As dusk settles across the valley, the pyramids darken into massive silhouettes, and the avenue fades into a pattern that feels almost organic despite its rigid geometry. The city's order suggests a worldview in which landscape, cosmos, and society met in negotiated harmony, a harmony no longer fully recoverable from material traces alone. The grid endures as a vast, unresolved diagram inscribed upon the earth, a testament to coordination, belief, and cultural imagination whose underlying logic now lingers as an echo carried to the open plazas and into the quiet of the valley. Across the volcanic uplands of central Java, where morning fog coils upward from terrace fields and ridges dissolve into soft haze, Borobudur's mandala-like form rises with a calm precision that reveals its complexity only upon ascent. From afar, it appears as a single-stepped mass, but as one climbs, its nested galleries unfold. Relief-lined corridors, meditative pathways, and circular terraces arranged in a geometry mirroring Buddhist cosmology. Carved in volcanic andesite, the lower panels narrate karmic cycles, maritime journeys, courtly scenes, and celestial realms. These stories encircle the monument not as a linear tale, but as a meditative progression understood through movement rather than inscription, for no contemporary text survives to fix the monument within a single doctrinal school or explicitly identify its royal patronage. Engineering challenges add another layer of subtle tension. Constructed in the 8th and 9th centuries under the Salandra dynasty, the builders confronted a volcanic hill prone to subsidence and water infiltration. Their solution required hidden retaining walls, compacted fill, stone-lined drains, and layered terraces designed to stabilize shifting soil. These unseen structures reveal not only technical insight, but also the adaptive problem-solving required to harmonize monumental ambition with unstable geology. That such care was invested in subterranean architecture, work that would never be visible, suggests a dedication to both spiritual vision and structural longevity, a merging of engineering and cosmology characteristic of Borobudur's quiet grandeur. And so the monument rises through a sequence of realms, its final circular terraces crowned with perforated stupas and a once-complete central dome. As light moves across the stone, the reliefs shift in tone, and the monument becomes a living diagram of ascent and release. Borobudur endures as both architectural accomplishment and spiritual landscape, an intricate expression of belief whose technical aspects can be studied, but whose full cosmological intent remains partly veiled in the silence of a world that has passed. And the discovery of an encased earlier foundation beneath the visible monument reveals that Borobudur was not the product of a single, uninterrupted design, but a structure reshaped as builders confronted shifting soil conditions and perhaps shifting ideological priorities. This hidden base, once buried under layers added for stability, adds a complex stratigraphy that hints at decisions no longer preserved in surviving chronicles, decisions in which engineering necessity and symbolic intent intertwined. As the ascent reaches the upper circular terraces, the geometry begins to drift toward abstraction. The narrative reliefs fall away, replaced by open sky and the quiet rhythm of perforated stupas arranged like a constellation in stone. Within these lattice forms, seated Buddha images appear in various states of preservation or absence, some intact, others removed or damaged through periods of iconoclasm or repurposing whose motivations remain uncertain. These absences reflect the layered religious shifts of Java, where Buddhist patronage eventually receded as political centers moved and other spiritual traditions rose, leaving the monument to fade beneath volcanic ash and dense vegetation. 20th century restoration stabilized much of Borobudur, revealing interlocking stone set without mortar, drainage systems fine-tuned to redirect monsoon water, and a concealed hidden foot, a base carved with reliefs illustrating karmic warnings before being sealed. These discoveries clarified how the monument functioned as an engineering system, yet the larger question, why Borobudur was eventually abandoned, remains unresolved. Hypotheses range from political decentralization and the movement of royal courts to environmental change and volcanic instability, but none fully explains how a monument of such magnitude drifted out of ritual use. The mandala-like plan invites further inquiry. The transition from square terraces to circular ones mirrors symbolic diagrams of the Buddhist cosmos, suggesting an experiential journey from the material world toward transcendence. With no surviving contemporaneous text to articulate its doctrinal framework, understanding relies on comparative symbolism and the spatial choreography of circumambulation, a reading grounded in observation, yet inevitably speculative. Scholars examining the distribution of niches, stupas, and alignments note the interplay between the monument's axes and the volcanic peaks surrounding it, Merapi, Merbabu, and Sumbing, hinting that Borobudur may have been conceived as part of a wider sacred landscape rather than a solitary structure. The degree of intentionality behind these alignments remains debated, given the region's variable topography and changing sacred geographies over time. The monument setting between two rivers and near routes linking competing dynastic centers introduces another dimension. Borobudur may have functioned simultaneously as a spiritual mandala and a political statement, a declaration of Salandra authority expressed through Buddhist cosmology rendered in stone. Yet the political context remains fragmentary, inferred from inscriptions found elsewhere and stylistic parallels, rather than surviving explanations of patronage or purpose. Reaching the summit, one encounters a great central stupa, plain, sealed, and without internal chamber. Its unadorned form contrasts with the dense iconography of the galleries below. Whether its emptiness was intended as a symbolic gesture toward the ineffable or simply the architectural culmination of Borobudur's concentric design remains unanswered. Around it, the upper terrace is open to a panorama where the monument's shadow merges at certain hours with the contours of distant peaks. Fleeting visual alignments that may once have carried seasonal or ritual significance now lost to time. As evening settles over the Kidu Plain, softening the reliefs into muted contours while warm, humid air gathers around the terraces, Borobudur becomes less a deciphered mandala than a living question. Its structure can be measured, its reliefs interpreted, its engineering analyzed. But its deepest intentions, why it was reshaped, how it was used, what metaphors guided its creators, what rituals animated its galleries, remain suspended between clarity and silence. The monument stands grounded in skill, cosmology, and historical context, yet still carrying within its terraces the residue of meanings only partially recoverable. Across the lowland forests of Cambodia, where monsoon clouds billow above reservoirs and tree-lined embankments, anchor what rises with a calm precision that conceals the intricacy of its astronomical and spatial logic. Beneath its soaring galleries, vaulted corridors, and narrative bas-reliefs lies a structure whose alignments and proportions intertwine cosmology, kingship, and hydraulic engineering in a way that resists any single explanation. Approaching along the Western Causeway, an unusual orientation in a region where major temples typically face east, one is immediately drawn into a dialogue between architecture and celestial cycles. The westward orientation may relate to Vishnu's associations or to the monument's role as a funerary temple for Surya Varman II, but no surviving inscription articulates the original rationale, leaving meaning suspended between inference and silence. Moving inward along the axial galleries, the precision of the east-west alignment becomes clear. The central tower frames equinoctial sunrise with striking accuracy, though whether this alignment was deliberately calibrated for repeated astronomical observation or arose from symbolic east-west orientation remains debated. Khmer tradition often employed cosmological metaphors, Mount Meru, the ocean creation, without necessarily embedding strict calendrical functions. Within this ambiguity, Angkor Wat's bas-reliefs deepen the interpretive challenge. They depict vast narrative cycles from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Khmer courtly history, arranged in a sequence that appears to encourage clockwise ritual movement, known in Vaishnavite worship. Yet the temple's architectural logic subtly pulls movement counterclockwise, producing a tension between narrative and space that suggests shifting ritual priorities or layered uses across centuries. Beyond narrative and orientation lies the hydraulic world that sustains the temple. The vast moat surrounding Angkor, what participates in a larger network of barrays, canals, and spillways that supported agriculture on a monumental scale. Its purpose, however, sits at the intersection of practicality and symbolism. It may have served irrigation needs, embodied the cosmic ocean, or blended both roles, but sediment patterns and shifting water management systems complicate reconstruction of its original function. The urban environment revealed through LiDAR, grids of streets, habitation mounds, reservoirs, dissolves any image of Angkor as an isolated masterpiece. Instead, it appears as a central node in a vast city, its alignments informing access routes, procession paths, and administrative precincts. The sandstone blocks used in construction, quarried at Phnom Kulen, were transported along engineered routes and fitted without mortar using dowel holes and precisely cut joints. This method aligns fully with known Khmer engineering, yet its consistent execution across such scale hints at organizational systems not fully documented in royal inscriptions. The inward battered walls and the corbel vaults lend the temple long-term resilience, yet the conceptual intent behind its exact proportions, some of which seem to echo calendrical cycles, remains open to interpretation. Ascending toward the central sanctuary, steep stairs compress the body into deliberate humility, creating a physical parallel to spiritual ascent. But the sanctuary's current form is filtered through centuries of Buddhist adaptation, which alter its arrangement and obscured elements of the original ritual layout. Archaeologists must rely on faint pedestals, sockets, and votive distributions to infer what once occupied these sanctified spaces. In late afternoon, when sunlight strikes the western facade and the bas-reliefs shimmer between motion and stillness, anchor what reveals itself as both a technical accomplishment and an unresolved text. Its construction method, material sources, and broad symbolic framework are understood, yet the intimate choreography of ritual, the political messaging embedded in its proportions, and the cosmological logic guiding its alignments remain only partially visible. The temple opens onto a horizon of inquiry that endures precisely because its meanings cannot be fully recovered. As twilight gathers over moat and the humid air settles beneath the forest canopy, Angkor Wat becomes a monument not just to Khmer engineering, but to the quiet persistence of unanswered questions, lingering like the fading silhouettes of its towers against the deepening dusk.